Hello everyone, welcome. We are back online live. It's been a little while. Yesterday I was in Kenya. Tomorrow I'll be in Dubai. So in between, we're going to do a live on that thing, Capture One. So welcome to everyone that is watching live today. Today being the 14th of November. If anyone's looking at a different day, that's not today. But if you're watching playback, then obviously you've got complete control. You can fast forward, rewind, whatever else. If you're watching live, please put your comments or your questions or anything else like that in so that we make this as interactive as possible, because I don't have all the answers. Quite often you guys do. So we'll try and edit your photos in as interactive way as possible, and that relies on you putting questions into the feed, and we'll try and cover as many of those as we can. So for all of you that are new to this, we're going to spend the next hour editing, as I say, in that piece of software, Capture One. There's a couple of updates I want to run through with people, because obviously there's been a new version released quite recently, which specifically, the big highlight for it, amongst other things, is AI masking. So we're going to be venturing into that, I guess, in a lot of ways today, and also not venturing into it. So it's not always the right tool, and we'll cover some of that today as well. So we've got some of your raw images. So that's the data that your camera collects on its sensor. Looks generally pretty flat because it's what your eyes actually saw, not what your brain interpreted. So we then use Capture One as one of the possible editing software pieces out there to be able to convert that data and that raw image into what you remember seeing. And that's what we're going to do today with your shots. So for all of you that are online live, as I say, make it as interactive as possible. For those of you that are not on Capture One, go to captureone.com. You can download a free trial. It works for 30 days and give it a play. So we won't go into that too much, but what we will go into is New World current release. So every single time we do one of these sessions, or it feels like it anyway, I have to update that slide because that number there changes. And the reason it changes is because the software is continually updated and is improved and has bugs fixed and blah, blah, blah. So for those of you with a very beady eye, as of the last update, so 16.3, you will notice that something changed. And it didn't change necessarily in the normal way, the number, so the 16.2.5 and then 16.3 and 16.3.1. It changed in this way. Spot the difference? So some time ago, there used to be, in fact a long time ago, there used to be Capture One Express, Capture One Pro, Capture One for Sony, Capture One for Nikon, and loads of other different variations. We sort of settled on Capture One Pro. That was what everyone ended up working on. And in, I think, version 20 off the top of my head, so in 2020, they released Capture One 20 and started aligning it to years. So there was always this big thing. I'm just going to put the old version back up. So this Capture One 23 / 16.2.5 always confused people. So there's a difference between the marketing number, which was based on a year, and the version number, which was based on the software engineers behind the scenes making changes to the software, whether that was a major change, so the first number, the 15, 16, 17, and so on. A point release, which was a significant functionality change, which is the next dot, so the 0.2, 0.3 in the case we're at the moment. And then let's call it service releases or bug fixes, which is the last dot, so the 0.5 in this case, or as it is now, the 0.1. So as part of the licensing change that was announced about a year ago, what Capture One have done now, as of 16.3, is removed the Capture One Pro, removed the version number from the program. So when you used to launch Capture One, it would actually have be Capture One 23 or Capture One Pro 22 or whatever. It's now just Capture One. And that version will keep changing behind the scenes. So the version number, that bit, will keep changing every time new functionality is built, or every time a bug release is done, or every time there's a major upgrade. The difference that you're going to see is none. Because the version that, or the icon that you click on is now just going to be called Capture One. So ironically, it makes life simple. Unfortunately, that's also led to lots of questions. So a lot of people are now asking, well, hold on a second. I bought 16.2. 16.3 is out. Why don't I get that? So just to recap, for anyone that's on a subscription, this version number thing here, this bit, meaningless. Just be on the latest version. So if that's 16.3.1, 16.3.2, or as will come, I'm sure, at some point, either 16.4 or 17 or 27 or whatever, just keep to the latest one. That's what you pay for. That's what your subscription's for. If, however, you're on a perpetual license, so the perpetual license being where you've bought the software, in quotes bought, so you own it. Lots of people used to use or like to use that phrase. You've bought a particular point in time. And the point in time in software terms is that 0.3 bit. So the 16.3, that means 0.3.0, 0.3.1, 0.3.2, 0.3.3, and so on, until that number clicks over to either 0.4, or maybe the big number comes along and it changes to 17. But what you've got with the new perpetual licenses, so anyone buying a perpetual license now, you're buying that functionality, that license, that feature set. So if you want AI masking, if you buy it now as a perpetual license, you get AI masking. If they release a, I don't know, fluorescent unicorn insertion tool for the sky in the next version, the next major version of Capture One, as a perpetual license holder, you don't get that. What you will have is an option to upgrade, and there's a loyalty program and whatever else. But if you're on the subscription, you will get whatever comes along. Perpetual license holders are fixed in their functionality at the point in time they bought it, apart from bug releases, which is that last dot, the 0.1, the 0.1, the 0.2, 0.3, and so on. So that's where we're at. As of now, everyone who's on the latest version of Capture One, which is what we're running today, if you go to About Capture One, it will show you it's 16.3.1. There was a minor service release that came out after 16.3. If you're on a previous version to that, or your icon says Capture One 23 or Capture One Pro 22 or whatever, then you're not on the latest version, and you've got choices. You can subscribe, you can upgrade a perpetual license, you can buy it if you don't have it, or you can download the free trial. And remember, if you're on an older version of Capture One, you can always download a free trial of the newer one to test it out. Just be careful, because any catalogs you create and certain adjustments and whatever may not be backward compatible into your older version if you stick with it. Right, so yeah, Tim, David's online, so David can be a question person if you want. But Tim, yeah, with this change I now have two versions installed. Can I install 16.2.5 without destroying something? Yes. If you're happy with 16.3.1, or Capture One as it's now called, you can go ahead and uninstall previous versions. You used to do this anyway, so you used to have like Capture One 21, 22, 23. When you put 23 on, you choose. You could either keep 21 and 22 as applications, or you can remove them. So it's the same as before, but yes, you can uninstall, you can remove it. It won't make any difference as long as you're using the newer version instead. Or as David Grover's just put it, nuke it. So let's go into Capture One, and I'm glad that David's online, because we're going to talk about today a little bit when AI doesn't work. Just for fun. So this is a shot from Chris. It's a wind farm, or wind turbines on the top of a ridge. And the question is how to get the turbines to stand out more. So what Chris has got is a bit of a black and white conversion going on. If I go into the edits and let's look at our black and white tool. So those sliders have been moved, and the sliders in the black and white tool are designed to change the brightness or luminosity of different channels of color. So where in the original image, let's say there's a lot of blue in here, which there is. If I pick on the blue slider and I darken or lighten, it's only really affecting the blue channel, as it were, in there. So that's a way of controlling our contrast when we do a black and white conversion. The problem with this shot is there's not a lot of contrast to start with. And if I move my mouse around, so if you look at these numbers at the top, so these are our readout for wherever the mouse is. That's telling us the red, green, and blue channels, and also the overall luminosity. So as I move that around, I'm seeing that although, yeah, there is, there's gradient or graduation in tones. There's some greeny bits there, slightly more red here. I can see the red channel going up from, 20s and 30s up to 40s and 50s. But most of it is pretty blue, pretty green. So let's have a little look at what we can do to separate the windmills out, because, yeah, I agree. They're a little bit, I think it was shot from a plane window, he said. So I get it. It's a bit of a challenge to do, but let's see what the tools can do for us. So first thing that has changed, and one thing as well, with a major update with Capture One, always remember this. Your workspace may reset to the default generic Capture One. You may not have all your icons back. If you go to the window menu, go to workspace, you'll see I've got quite a lot. Capture One will automatically back up your workspace, but you can also save a custom workspace, which I'd encourage you all to do. So when you've got this set up, go to Window, up top, Workspace, Save Workspace, and it means that whenever you do a version upgrade, you can always go back to your personalized, or it's actually off the screen on mine, but you've got a customized workspace that you can always refer back to. The downside to doing that, just a flag, there's a little warning shot there. If Capture One introduce a new tool, for instance, let's say the dust spot removal tool, unless I know about it, it won't necessarily be added onto my custom workspace, because my custom workspace was designed before that tool existed. So it pays you to read the release notes, it pays you to keep up to date with what functions are on there, because if you do stick with an older workspace, one of the reasons that Capture One resets your workspace when you do a major upgrade is to show you the new tools. So you won't necessarily see it, you may have to add it manually. And yes, I need to do a little bit of a sort out of my workspaces, thank you. So with the AI subject selection tools now in place, we've got a completely different way of looking at the layers tool tab. So a few things have flipped. The pluses and minuses for new layers have gone from the bottom to the top. Luma range has switched around. Refine mask has become promoted. So it used to be hidden on a, in fact, let's just create a new layer. Right click and you'd have refine mask there. You now have a special button on there, and it's because the AI tools use refine mask a lot. So there's a bit of a change around that. We've also now got new brushes. So we've got the original brush that was always there. Magic Brush, which was introduced quite a few versions ago now, and we've now got AI Brush, and we also have the same reciprocal erasers. So standard eraser, magic eraser, and AI eraser. Fine. And then we've got these two little functions up here, subject and background. And on a simpler shot, so let me just go, I'm not saying this is simple, Paul, but we're going to come back to this shot later on. Let's create a new variant of this. I'm going to just crop it down to there. We're going to come on to this shot in a bit. Go to my layers, and if I click on subject, it's going to select, let me just put a grayscale mask on there, the subject automatically. Great. If I click on background, it's going to create a new background mask for me, which is kind of the opposite to the subject. Great. So I've now got my two layers by one click of a button. As I say, we'll come back to this because it didn't quite get the subject as you saw, but on Chris's version, let's try the subject tool. So I'm going to delete this adjustment mask. There's nothing there. So this is the pure raw file. Click on subject. And let's put a grayscale mask up. Maybe I'm missing it because I'm zoomed in, or not. So the subject mask, unfortunately, the AI subject mask didn't find it. So maybe we'll try the background mask instead and sort of invert it. So let's go to background. No, it's masked the whole thing. So there's not enough detail or contrast or something like that in this shot in order to see that I want these windmills to be the subject. And actually it would have to know I want the windmills to be the subject. So I could arguably use a luminosity mask. So for instance, if I were to draw a mask, so 100%, nice and soft edges, and let's click on this little windmill here to there. Okay, now a Luma range is really, really handy because it means that I can select only the bits I want of the windmill. And if I look around here, to change my mouse, so back to these numbers at the top, as I'm moving around the windmill, I can see these luminosities are around about, you can see up here this grey one, that's what the luma range looks for. So 80s to 90s to 70s, okay, fine. So let's put a luma range in that goes up to maybe 110 and starts at that sort of 80 or 70 to 80, I think that was where we were sort of at. Okay, so that's done an okay job. It's not perfect. There's a bit of fall off on it, but it sort of gets the windmill. So let's apply that. And what we could do now is start painting in on the other windmills, because it's only going to pick up the luminosity that's in that range. So as I'm painting, I'm actually painting really roughly. You can see I'm not painting on the blades. But as I go into here, it's now only going to paint on the areas that have that matching luminosity in that range. If I go back to the luma range, this is the range it's picking up. So that's another way of being able to select those windmills. But you'll see as I start going into the background, and that's actually just done a perfect example there, some of these other luminosities also match it. And some of the bits of the windmill aren't in that luminosity range. And if I were to increase the luminosity range, or the luma range, so let's go out to there and out to there to get the windmill, great. But now I'm getting the ground. And if I have the fall off too hard, so you can see it's starting to mix, it's starting to blend, it's starting basically to get really messy. So this becomes not really a quick way of doing this, because I've now got to go through manually and get rid of the bits I don't want. So almost like a death-defying tool that everyone thought had its day. Let's try Magic Brush. So Magic Brush used to be effectively our AI tool, as it were. So it would allow us to choose an area in the image, or a section of the image, and apply that same logic of this looks similar to other parts that are connected to it. Or what if I do sample entire photo, really small brush, really tight tolerance, and say, let's go, I'm going to go really tightly in, and I'm going to go to my Magic Brush, and I'm going to click here. And I'm going to click here to add a bit, and click here to add a bit. And all I'm doing is just clicking on bits of these turbines. So let's just click there. Nope, too much. But I think if I zoom out, let's just turn on our grayscale mask. So Alt and M to turn on your grayscale mask. That's done a pretty good job. It's not perfect, but it's done a pretty good job. And the way that I can get it perfect, or better, is on here, Refine Mask, which is now a button rather than a right click, but you can still right click. And Refine Mask, the temptation people have is to whack this up as far as possible. You can do that, but it's going to grab more things that we don't necessarily want. So I'm going to pull this back to the point where we're getting the blades, the very ends of the blades, but we're not getting too much of the background. And where we are getting parts of the background, it's faded. So I now have quite a nice mask of all the windmills. Because it's a mask, the same way as any other mask, I can now erase the bits that I don't want. So there's definitely some bits in there. I could, I could really start tidying it up, but I don't really necessarily need to. But let's have a little look here, here. Get rid of that bit. I'm doing this in grayscale because it helps me to see all the sort of remnant bits that you can't necessarily see if you leave the mask on the picture, because this red isn't quite strong enough. But I've now got a mask that fits every single one of those windmills by clicking 3 times with Magic Brush. So, to David's point before I get there, this is a good example of, and this is the thing that worries me. I remember when Magic Brush came out, everyone stopped using Auto Mask. Everyone stopped using normal brush because Magic Brush does it. Well, it doesn't always. AI masking, so AI Brush doesn't always get it right. The AI subject selection tool sometimes can't see the subject. You've just seen an example of that. So it's not a case of necessarily, sometimes maybe, but not a case that every single time a new tool gets introduced within Capture One, it replaces a previous one. They're just extra tools you can use. And I've seen quite a lot of messages with people saying, I can't get AI to work on this topic or this subject or this image. Try the other tools that you used to use, because they actually work just as well as they always used to. In fact, they still get developed, they still get worked on, they still get improved. It's just you've now got another tool in your toolbox to play with. So if I have a look at this image now, so I've got never display mask on there. With my windmill mask, we want the windmills to stand out. Bingo. Now that's probably pushing it a bit because that's pretty white, but you know, we might have lost a little bit of texture in there, a little bit of detail. But you know, I could put a little bit of an exposure boost, a little bit of a contrast boost, a little bit of a brightness boost, which won't push things over the edge of highlights quite so much. Then I can go on to the rest of our background. Now, think about it. I've now got a mask that's got our windmills. And just like with AI, if only I could choose between the subject and the background, if only I could do that. Well, I can, because also in 16.3 is we've now got duplicate selected layer, which takes, so we used to have to create a new layer and then go copy mask from and then choose it. Well, now it does this all in one go. So duplicate selected layer, and I'm going to call this one background. In fact, no, we're not. We're going to call this one windmills, and we're going to call this one wrong mills. Whatever. But in this one, invert the mask, I now have a background layer that's the exact opposite of what I chose for the windmill layer. So with this background, we could then, for example, because remember, it's duplicated the exact layer, so it's taken all the adjustments as well. I'm going to reset this. I'm going to pull my exposure down. I'm going to maybe pull some clarity in there, but only on the background. So we get some texture in there. I'm going to maybe pull a little bit of contrast up. So that's going to darken it because it's already dark, so it's pushing it a little bit darker. And then with our windmills layer, I can afford now to really pull these up a little bit more. With the overall image, now that I've given the windmills a bit of a boost and the background a bit of a additional, I guess, depth through adding that darkness, I can go to levels and we can pull that up. And we can do that. So we're now stretching the histogram. We're forcing the bits that were slightly bright to be brighter, the bits that were slightly darker staying where they are, and the bits that are very dark aren't changing at all. So we're adapting, we're stretching that histogram to make it look more vivid. And if I go from before to after, that's how we make the windmills stand out. Now we can, exactly like Chris had already done, go to enable black and white. And we could, if we wanted to, pull those blues to be a little bit darker. Pull the red. I don't remember actually what Chris did. So yellow's down, cyan's up, magenta. So it was pretty much yellow's down, cyan's up a little bit, which is a bit odd. If we want, you know, if everything in there is cyan and blue and we want it to stand out, maybe we go to sort of there. I'd be tempted to play with the green, but there isn't much in there. There's so much blue color cast. There's a bit of a challenge. Nothing much with magenta. Now remember, this black and white tool is referring to the colors that are underlying in the image, which means if I'm darkening blues, and you saw cyans, you know, a little bit up there, I can go into the color editor and I can say anything that's vaguely blue, saturate it more. And the impact of saturating it more, it becomes more blue. So then the black and white tool kicks in and says, right, well, I need to make you darker. So you can actually play with not just the black and white color sensitivity, but the underlying colors in the image and make them darker or lighter by playing with saturation if they're already in there. The other thing to bear in mind is white balance. So if you look at the before image, this image is very, very blue. If I clone this variant, let's change this white balance so the image is more yellow. Let me just turn off the black and white tool so you can see. So if I start neutralizing the image, so back to yellow, oh, no, maybe about there, that's probably about right. Probably wasn't quite the complete blue wash that sort of came through the haze of the window. We could also, speaking of that, use dehaze as a tool. So let's use the dehaze tool to add some clarity into there as well. But the result of that, because this has become less blue underneath it all, when I click on enable black and white, those blues aren't getting pulled down so much because there's not as much of the blue. Jim, yes, so there is still some use for us old tools. Yes, there are. And no, David, they're not windmills. Sorry, they're not wind turbines, they're windmills. From a distance, they're windmills. So we've now got a image where we've got complete control of 3 different elements. One, the overall color tone, and that affects the black and white tool. The black and white tool ignores any masks. It's only operating on the image layer. For those of you with, again, beady eyes, this has stopped being called background. It's now called image layer. Why? Because it's the layer with the actual image on. The reason was, I believe, because we're now using subject and background as named layers. So background being an object rather than the bottom layer, it doesn't make logical sense to also have a background layer. So it's now called the image layer. The black and white tool applies to the image layer. It's indiscriminate of any mask, any adjustments that are made to that mask, any luma ranges, it doesn't matter. It's only ever going to apply to the whole background layer. So, but it does get affected, as you've seen, by colors in the underlying image. So if I go back to Chris's first one here, where, yes, it's very vivid, and that's partly as part of the other adjustments that Chris has made. So I think there's some highlight recovery, some contrast stuff. Where are we? Contrast has been whacked way up to 31, I think, to try and get the windmills or wind turbines to show. And then because that contrast has been whacked way up, we then have to pull the highlights down to recover them. So you end up in this horrible cycle of trying to recover things that you've already done. So you end up sort of confused. You end up in a loop that's very difficult to get out of. By doing it this way, and this may not be the planned outcome. So if we go to a similar crop to what Chris had, I think we were sort of there, something like that. We've now got complete control of the 3 elements. We can control the underlying image, and to Tony's point, yep, the color balance tool equally does change the black and white tool's output. So in the color balance tool, as we start shifting, let's say the shadows, let's move them away from being blue to be more yellow. So you start changing, I'm talking about the color balance tool, is going to give you your output. Confused me there for a second, Tony. This is the problem. Color balance tool is going to give you, it's an output tool, not an input tool. So there's a challenge here, which is as we start changing this, we're not changing the input into the black and white tool. We're changing what's coming out in the final image. So it's moving shadows to be saturated in green or highlights to be unsaturated or desaturated in blue. So slightly different, but you can actually achieve the same thing using the split tone tool instead. So in the black and white tool, you've actually got a funky way of doing this, which is if I want my highlights to be slightly warm and yellow, let's saturate them, not that much. And my shadows to be slightly blue, let's saturate that. That's where it's kind of like playing with the color balance tool when the black and white tool is enabled. If it's not, and you've got these down, then it's having no effect. But we can change the overall image. We can change the overall feel of the image using the black and white tool in here and all of your other tools up here. So on the background layer, we can say, actually, I do want more contrast, which is going to darken things, remember, because most of it sits down here in the shadows. The opposite of that, let's pull up shadows a little bit. So we can see that a bit clearer now. That's not affecting the windmills because they're in the highlights. So if I go into here and move my mouse around here, we can see we're at 183. Look up the top here. So the luminosity of that, 143, 127, I think there was an even brighter bit somewhere. But those bright bits, 169, you can see as well up here in the histogram. So if I'm affecting shadows, I'm not affecting the wind turbines, I'm only affecting the shadows in there. But I've got a mask on here that allows me to control what is and isn't being affected. So the image layer we can use to control the overall look of the image. I think from memory, Chris added, and still there, same old thing, gradient layer. Just remember that if you're not already on a layer, it will create one, or the layer doesn't exist, it will create one. If it does exist, it will overwrite the content on your layer. Let me just show you why that's important. Let's just delete that layer. So here is our wrong mills layer. I want to add a gradient mask on the top to darken it. So I go to my gradient tool. Oh. So what's happened is because I'm already on a layer. So if I'd done that with no layers available to me in here, it was just the image layer, Capture One will automatically create a new layer for my gradient mask. But because I was already on a layer that has a mask, when I go to the gradient tool, it's going to replace that layer or the mask on the layer with the gradient tool. So remember, it's even with whether it's an AI mask, a magic brush mask, a normal mask, doesn't matter. If you're on a layer, whatever you now do with a new, whether it's gradient or whether it's a radial mask, you need to create a new layer. So we'll call this top grad. And on this layer alone, I'm just going to add an extra little boost to, well, reduction in exposure. Now, one thing to bear in mind in here, you notice here we are also affecting the windmills, because remember this layer doesn't have the windmills removed. So I've got a few things I could do. I could magic eraser and get it out, or instead I can, instead of using the exposure tool, I can say, well, I just want to take the shadows and I want to take the shadows down. And that's going to leave the wind turbines or windmills where they were. If I want this to be a bit more acute, well, let's turn our mask on, go back to my gradient tool and say I only want to affect up here. Let's just get that straight. So now my drop-off's a bit more severe, but that's going to be personal choice. You can choose how much you want to affect it and how quickly. But this may be very different to what Chris had in mind. But on this version here of this image, I don't have any ability really to separate out my subject from my background, because I don't have a mask that has the subject and the background separately. The best way of doing it in this image is not using the AI tool. It's not using the AI brush, not using the subject selection tool, none of that stuff. It's good old magic brush. It's the old school. I say old school, it's only a couple years old, I think. But if you look at the control we've now got over this image, that magic brush step has done a great job with refined mask. So remember, and those of you that have been watching for a while, you'll know that quite often when I'm doing any masking, the almost default step when we finish the masking is to use the refine tool to smooth out. And it's just to give you a little bit more, I guess, leeway with those changes so they don't seem so abrupt as a result of implementing them. So use the refine mask tool. Also remember, you can still use the eraser. You can still use the brush tool to add extra bits. The AI masks, the magic brush masks, every mask still behave in the same way they always used to. It's just another tool you can use. It doesn't mean it's the only one. So let's just get rid of that mask. It's Chris's choice as to how you want to take that. You could get this to there. I agree, Chris. I think you lose the windmills in there. Yeah, your call. You can play with this. We'll send it to you. So you can play with it to your heart's content. You could play with a curve as well, probably a Luma curve, because the black and white is getting rid of any color data. But you could get up to there. So we're gonna enhance the brights a bit more and then maybe leave it to there. Your choice. But the difference being we've now got three things we can play with. The background for global changes. You could have another layer with global changes if you want. The windmills layer, which only affects the turbines, and the wrong mills layer, which only affects the not turbine stuff. Cool. So there we go. AI tools. Epic when you need them. If you don't need them, don't have to use them. Georg, I'm just going to reset. I was actually playing with this while we were waiting, because the question from Georg was, how do I make the city effectively pop, I guess, a bit more? So this is the original, this is the new. I think from memory, I think there was a bit of a brightness adjustment I made, but how do you make a city look vibrant? Well, I think from memory, David and we did an edit on Chicago back in June. I think it was June, July when we were out there. And one of the things that's maybe a bit that a lot of people get stuck in with cities, if you're shooting them at night, the image looks very dark. Well, of course it does, because it's dark, it's night. But you've got bits of the city that really do come to life. And the problem that you have is this huge swing. And I'm just going to pull out a separate histogram window. So create a floating tool called histogram. And the reason is because I want to show you in detail what's going on the histogram here. Let's just go to there. So as always, as I move my mouse around, this orange bar is telling me where I am in the data. So this data is from 0, so black, completely no light whatsoever output. Doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't captured, but it means it wasn't output. Through to 255 up here. Well, that's bright white effectively, but it doesn't necessarily mean white. It actually means that one or more of the channels is at 255 or above, and you've got 255 variants between 0 and 255, so between black and white. Not quite that, so between nothing and full exposure. So the red channel goes from nothing to fully red. The blue channel, nothing to fully blue. The result of that, or the effect of that, is what we see is black to white effectively. But remember, it's about the channel. It's not necessarily about black and white. It applies to any of these numbers. So if I turn on my exposure warning, we'll see, let's just zoom into here. So here's some exposure warnings. So there. And I can see on this, bright part here, look at the numbers at the top, 255, 255, 255, 255. So red is overexposed, green is overexposed, blue is overexposed. The combined effect is that the luminosity, that gray number up here, is also overexposed. Down here in this little porter cabin, also 255. But let's just have a little closer look. Let me move my mouse to here. What's going on here? So I've got 254, which is actually my clipping level for a warning. But then, well, what's happening with the green and the blue? Well, they're not overexposed, but I'm getting an overexposure warning in Capture One. It's telling me that one or more of the channels is clipped. It doesn't necessarily mean they're all clipped. And the reason is, if I turn this exposure warning off, there's a lot of yellow in here, which is made up of red and green, color theory. So in this yellow area here, this is telling me that this is overdone. It's overbaked. There's too much light. There's too much actually specifically red light in there. But also when we get to the whiter part of the light bulb, presumably, they're all there. Red, green and blue are all overexposed. Now, if I look at that on the histogram, what does that mean? Well, on this image, I've got loads of stuff in the shadows. So all of this down here is sat in the shadows. All of this down here in the lower mid-tones, so lower here, that's shadows, I guess. This is sort of creeping up to the mid-tones. Here is a bit more mid-tony in these lights. So we're looking at this area here and thinking they're lights. They're bright. Wonderful. But they're not. They actually sit just here in the mid-tones. So they're not quite up there with the highlights. Where the highlights are these specular highlights. So we can see this little peak here, tiny little peak. You could almost miss it on the smaller one over here. But this tiny little peak is telling you that there are certain parts of this image which are absolutely overexposed. And here's the problem. If I go on this image, let me just create a new variant so we don't do anything bad. And I push the exposure up in order to see more of the shadows. Look at what's happening to these highlights. I'm really blowing them. So in the exposure warning, we get a load more. So let me just temporarily undo that. So a few exposure warnings here and there on the specular highlights. I want to see what's in the shadows. Wow, I've got loads of stuff now that's got so much light, whether it's red, green or blue, coming in, that when we output it, there's going to be no data there whatsoever. It's going to be empty of any data. And you can sort of see that when you zoom in. You know, this light here has lost all of the details. So in here, we could see these little sort of ribs in the rooftop in the background. If I put that exposure back to where it was, so I can now see in the shadows, great, but I can't see the detail in the highlights. So exposure doesn't work, especially on cities. So let's just get rid of our little floating tool. If ever you want a big version of a tool, remember, window, create a floating tool, and you can choose whichever one you want, and then you can scale it. It's really handy for curves. Drawing curves in this tiny little box here can be a real pain. Doing it in a big box like this, you can be a lot more accurate in terms of where those numbers are. So let's just remove that tool. Right. So I want to see more shadow, but I do not want to overexpose the highlights. In Capture, again, this is another example of new tool doesn't necessarily replace the old tool. We used to just have in HDR highlights and shadows. We now have a black tool and a white tool. And what they do is they focus on the very darkest parts of the image and the very brightest parts of the image. And the temptation in a city shot like this is to use that black tool to bring it up. The problem with doing that is because it's only focusing on a specific small chunk of that histogram at the very, very bottom, effectively it's flattening, it's compressing that lower end of the histogram into the rest of the lower midtones. And that means we lose contrast. Everything becomes the same. It becomes muddy, it becomes murky. You can sort of see in here, it's very flat. There's no contrast left. So using the black tool sparingly is one thing, but using it at all, I'd be careful with it. In this case, in this image, I would use shadow, because shadow is going to move more of the lower end of the histogram up together and stretch it out. So we keep the contrast going. And then we can use more brightness. And brightness, a little bit like I was saying with the shadow tool, using 100% shadow recovery is pretty punchy. But as long as we don't use it with other HDR tools, it doesn't actually hurt us. When I see people doing this, and that's when it goes wrong. If you're using all of these sliders in opposite directions, what you're doing is you're compressing the histogram into the middle, you lose all contrast, and it becomes like a cartoon. So don't do that. Concentrate on what's the most important bit that you want to improve. So is it that you want to bring up the shadows? In this case, yes, we do. So use the shadow tool and then look at other tools that can help you. So the first one is brightness. We can use a little bit of the brightness tool. Brightness has an advantage. It doesn't hurt these very, very bright exposures or the bright high exposure areas. It allows us to protect them. The next, I've used shadow. Okay. Now let's just use white just to protect those. Remember, white is only the very, very brightest parts, just like black is only the very, very darkest parts. So there's a gap in this image between the bright parts up here and then the rest of the data that's sat down here. So let's protect those alone. We're not using the highlight tool because that compresses stuff again. We're using the white tool just to protect those very, very bright parts and pull them in a little bit, because I'm then going to go into the curve tool and we're going to boost the midtone or the lower midtone, which is where all this data sits. So I'm going to protect our highlights. I'm going to anchor there. And that stops anything I now do to the left of this line from affecting my highlights. I'm now going to lift those shadows up, lift our midtones up. Maybe I don't actually, and leave the shadows where they were, leave the dark parts where they were. I could do that. That's the equivalent of pulling up the black slider. It's a bit more, it's a bit harsh as well. But if I look at this scene compared to this scene, I've protected all of the highlights as much as I can. I've got the shadows lifted but kept their contrast, and that's the key thing. We don't just want to flatten the image and lose all contrast out of it. We want to keep the contrast. You want to keep the vivid nature of that city. And then the midtones we've got complete control of here in the curve. And yeah, as Prasad said, the curve tool is going to give you so much more control over this because, and going back to what I just showed you with the floating tools, in my curve tool, and I would encourage you to probably lay this out somewhere off of the screen in terms of where the bulk of your issues are so you can see stuff. But I can be really precise. I can even put in a little S-curve into the shadows. So I can say, look, leave the very bottom shadows where they are, pull that down a little bit, pull these lower midtones up a little bit. Maybe that needs to be reset there. I can put in these really, really tight curves. So the curve is changing. It's literally lifting or dropping the values as it goes along the histogram. So in this case here, if you look at the numbers at the bottom here on this tool, I'm saying anything that was 54, now make it 77, make it brighter. Anything that was 34, now make it 45. And do a ramp between those two. So we soften, and that's why it's called curves, because it softens it into a curve. But it's now lifting and pulling down. If I wanted to really pull down my highlights, I could. I could do that at the top end here. And I could pull this down here as well, which would start to protect those highlights. We'd start to see the stuff in this roof here, whereas as I pull them back up, you see the lights almost go on back in that roof. Let's just show you properly. So here's my roof. I can pull that down and see more detail in it. I can actually, we can go the other way. We can actually ruin it. We can go to sort of there, and we start to really hit these sort of hot spots in here. So these bits are now completely overexposed because I've pulled our baseline there. I've basically said anything that was 232, again, see down the bottom, now make it 255. Do the opposite of what we try and do. So use that, absolutely use that as a way of controlling to a better extent what's going on in the city. I've just seen a note here. Paul and David, I'm in the market for a new Mac. There's M2 Pro with 32 gig of RAM sufficient for Capture One 16.2 or 16.3. Yes, it is. An M1 is also sufficient. 16 gig of RAM is a nice sweet spot at the lower end of it. 32 is better. To ruin the surprise, I'm playing with this later on tonight. New toy. So that's the M3 Max, which is rumored, and I've seen lots of tests, to be the equivalent of an M2 Ultra. So we're going to play with that later and see if it really is. But from a baseline, what I'd not now look at, but basically David will tell you this. The M1 when it first came out was a bit of a breath of fresh air. 16 gig was a nice sweet spot. I wouldn't go for 8. But 16 it feels a bit more than 16 gig in there. But I would look at either the Pro or the Max chips. If you're on Studio, then the Ultra chip is there. It's not going to help you a huge amount in Capture One because that's more about doing multiple things at the same time rather than one thing really fast. So what I'd look at is the sweet spot's kind of Max at 32 gig or 64 gig, I think. But less than that, 16 gig, perfectly fine. 32 gig better, 64 gig better, 128 gig. We're gonna have some fun. So yeah, the M2 versus M3. The M3 is much faster than the M1. It's quite fast compared to the M2, but the M2 is equally a good chip. It's really, really good. Yeah, there we go, Adam. So an M2 Pro with 16 gig and it runs great. They do. There you go, Jim as well. M2 Mini with 16 gig, no problems. So yeah, I mean, if you're coming from Intel onto an M series chip, anything you buy is going to be faster, basically. But I would personally try and avoid the 8 gig point. I would move up to 16 as a minimum. 32 is nice. Anything more than that, and you're into fun times. So in this case here, so back to Georg's shot, the top one is the original edit. Let's just go actually to the original. So the original shows us like we're really, really underexposed in the original, but the camera's got enough data in these shadows to really pull it up. But what this does, so by instead of using exposure or instead of using too many different HDR sliders, which actually has the effect of dropping contrast, by using only one or maybe two of the HDR sliders, which are these ones here. So you see on here the difference. In Georg's edit, it's all subtle here. And I don't think there's anything in here in terms of curve or anything like that, no. Whereas in mine, I've been a bit more extreme, but with less of the sliders, and then used a curve on top of that to really punch those lower midtones. And that's what gives you the pop in a city without seeing anything crushed in the shadows, blown in the highlights. Try and protect those highlights. Your camera's done a good job of capturing them. Don't throw them off the end of the wall. Don't make them more than 255. They're horrible. Okay, next up, Charlie, your rocks. So the question from Charlie is about a lot of the images that Charlie's creating look a little bit too processed. And I'd agree, but ironically, probably not for the reason that you think. The reason I can tell they're processed, and yes, you've saturated up the water a little bit. So if I go to before and after, which is the Y key on your keyboard, remember, so press Y and you get this little thing come up, or you've got the button up here on the top toolbar. But you've got more contrast in there. You've got deeper blues. You've got the rocks are a bit more clarified and so on. Great, no issue with that. And I don't actually think there's too much of a problem with the edit that's there. Where there's a big problem, and it is a big problem, and this is one of my pet peeves. Sloppy masking. I'm not going to dress it up. It's sloppy. So number one, let's label our layers with what they actually do. 1 through 12. Remember, you can have 16 layers, but 1 through 12 isn't very helpful when you come back to this image, Charlie, and want to look at it in a couple of years' time or a couple of months' time, whatever. Like, what was layer 6? So instead, what I end up doing is turning my mask on so I can see what's going on. Now, what's that mask about? Why are we affecting here but not in there? Why are we affecting a ring here and not there? When I look at this area around here on the rock, why are we not tight to the rock? So if we're going to affect the ocean like this, I want to affect all the parts of the ocean so I don't see a light glow. And if you look here, this glow here is because we've darkened this bit behind the mask and not darkened that bit. Same with the rocks. So if I go, where are we? Let's turn on, right, sky up here. So the sky in the edits, contrast whacked way up to 45, fine. Brightness dropped down to 40, that's okay as well. Highlights recovered to 100, that's okay too. What's not okay is that it's not just the sky, it's also the rock. And if I look at that rock, you can see that contrast, brightness pull down, highlight pull down is affecting the rock edge because the mask clips the rock. So if you're going to do, and you saw on the windmill shot, if you're going to do specific work on specific areas of an image, be specific. You can't be rough with this stuff, because if you are, this is the result, which is you'll see halos around areas where you've missed parts of the brightness. You'll see dark clipped edges where you've gone over it with a brush. And now with the tools that you've got, I'm not even going to do the AI thing on here because we don't actually need to. With the tools we've got, we can do this really, really well. So let's say we want to fix the sky. Well, let me just do a magic eraser and just click in here, click in there. I'm just tidying up basically into there. I think that's got rid of that. Now I want to fill in these areas. So I'm going to go to magic brush. I'm going to turn off the entire photo so that we don't get some bits we don't want. That's filled that in. Let's say we want to fill that in as well. A nice fall off around there is pretty nice. Now, refine mask, either right click, refine mask, or as of 16.3, click on refine mask. In fact, I'm going to turn on my grayscale mask so I can see what's going on. Habit, I keep right clicking, don't need to anymore. Let's increase that radius so we get a nice soft transition from what's masked and what's not. Lovely. I'm going to turn the mask off. Now, if I look at this edge, I'm going to zoom in actually so we can really see. Look at the edge of the rock, having now played with that mask. We don't have quite this dark line around here. And we can do that on every single one of these areas. So if I were to look at this one here, I think, I can't remember which layer it was, but yeah, it was layer 12 on the top one. So let's go to my layer 12 on the bottom one. And instead, we're going to go onto our magic brush and we're going to add in little bits of extra and the sea. Oops. Don't want that bit. That's fine. Again, refine mask. I just want to soften it a bit. Not that much. I don't want the fall off to be that much. But into there, hit apply. And you see, look at this halo that's around here on the rock. It's not here. It is here because there was actually a bit of the mask missing. But you can see it's that bit. It's the tiny little details that give away the amount of editing that's been done on something. And in this case here, let's just actually do it. So if I go to clone this variant, in fact, let me reset this one. Let's give AI a go. Subject, please. Capture one. Not bad. Now it's missed a bit. That's not a problem because in the AI tools, we've got our AI brush. And I can just now start moving around. So, and remember, if I want to be more specific, as I get closer, it becomes a little more accurate in terms of what I'm moving around. So click in there to add that rock. Let's add that rock, add that rock, add that one, add that one. I could even say I want all of that area there. In there. Do I want that rock? Maybe. Maybe that one too. That'll do. Oh, maybe these. So let's just add these. The capture one needs to catch up a little bit with me. Now, this is going to get a bit arduous, right? So I'm going to click every single rock. Well, remember, I can blend my use of Magic Brush with AI. So I can say, actually, I do want these dark bits of the rock, and then it's gone over the top over here. Well, remember, I can blend my use of traditional eraser with AI. I don't have to use the one tool to do all this stuff. But now I have a mask that is pretty perfect around that rock. If I want to keep doing it, get out of your head. So there's a button, use the button. If I wanted to use the refine mask tool to soften that edge, I'm going to keep it quite tight. So hit there, apply. And now with that rock, really specifically, I can go down into my clarity and I can give that a little bit of a pop. I can add some structure in there. I could add, just exactly like Charlie'd done already. So increase some contrast. We could lift the shadow a little bit if we wanted to. You know, loads of different options. We could increase some saturation if we wanted to, but I'm doing it just around that rock. Now, I'm not going to let AI do the background because it didn't get the foreground completely right. So I'm just going to create here and go, in fact, sorry, no, I'm going to create a new layer. And we're going to say not subject. Now, if you wanted to, you could create one for the sky. You could create one for the sea as well. But with not subject, as it were, I can right click on here, just like I could before. There's nothing different in 16.3 with this. And copy mask from subject mask. And then right click on here and say invert. So now I've got the opposite mask. And with that opposite mask, I want to be a little bit more forgiving. So I'm just going to remember Option M, or up here, go to display grayscale mask to see a little bit clearer. Go to my refine mask. And I can probably refine this one a little bit more, so it's a little bit more forgiving. And on this one, I could then pull up some contrast, pull up some saturation like Charlie had. We can do the highlight recovery. There's our sky back if we want to. We could add, if we wanted to as well, a little bit of clarity. We could even shift the white balance independently. So we can go warmer with that, or we can go cooler. Cooler might work. Yep, down to there. If we wanted to put in a curve, we could. You know, we could put a traditional S curve in to darken the shadows, lighten the highlights a little bit, but be careful again, you're not fighting with something, so you've already got a highlight recovery, so why would we then increase the highlights? So I've gone over the top specifically, just to show you, but if I look at here, where it does feel a little bit overworked, here looks a lot more natural, and the difference is those two masks. The masks are accurate. I don't have this edge around here or the edge around there because I don't have these random clips over the rock. Look at this one over here specifically. Let's look at this rock here. There's no reason for this edge of this rock to be clipped and dark other than the mask for the sky has gone over it. And because I have this one separate, I can go back to my subject mask, and if I want to, you know, rocks can take an awful lot of clarity and an awful lot of structure if you want them to. But that's going to really, really help bring some drama to it, which you can't do if you've got all of these masks overlapping each other. And yeah, Anthony, so, you know, again, going back to before, use Magic Brush with AI. You can always do it. And yeah, to Jeff's point, you could also use levels, same as curves. Very quickly, Paul, I think you're going to know where the answer is going with this on this maple leaf. So Paul's question was around the AI tool and whether it makes things look like they pop out too much to look like they're stuck on. So my AI tool, if you remember, I already clicked it and it did a subject mask. I'm not happy that it didn't get all of the subject. So I'm going to remove my background mask. In here, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit and I'm going to go back to my AI tool and I'm going to say, add this bit. It's very difficult to see a red AI tool when you can change the mask color, of course, but when you're on here, but let's just go back into my grayscale mask. So it's added, I think, the whole of that leaf. Yep. So if I want my background now, so in fact, first thing, Paul, specifically, when you've done an AI mask, always refine it. So not to the point where it picks up too much of the background, but just to give you a soft edge that helps with it not looking like it's been stuck onto the background. I'm going to create a new layer and I'm going to say copy mask from subject. And we're going to say background, because I'm not going to get AI to do it because it's going to miss that stalk again. But what I can do is invert the mask. So now I have background and leaf. So with my background, I could potentially pull down a little bit of exposure. Be careful, that gives you the impression that saturation's coming up as well. On my subject mask, I could maybe lift a bit of shadow. I could probably pull down some highlights to get a bit more detail. I could pull in a touch of clarity like that, a lot of structure to see all the veins in the leaf and all that sort of stuff. So if I look at before to after, but I would say that doesn't look like it's been stuck on. You're not missing anything in terms of the quality of the mask around the outside. You know, you can see it's actually a really, really detailed mask that it's built. It just needed a bit of help to see the stalk. And the background layer, we're just doing the exact opposite of the subject layer. So with that subject mask, we could even go into our color editor. So if we want to make the reds deeper, then use, you know, the lightness one. Note that it's only really affecting this part of the leaf, not that. Why? Because that part of the leaf, Capture One doesn't think is too red. If I click on here, it's over in the magentas and the purples. So use the advanced tool. I've clicked on the color, and with the advanced tool, I now pull down lightness. And I've now got complete control of that leaf on the area that's masked. So if there's other areas out here that are also magenta, it's not affecting them. So that's sort of done it. That's it, Paul, I think. So we can pick up on it again later, but hopefully, you know, you get the idea that the AI mask is one of the tools that we can use. In this case, if it's done accurately, it shouldn't look like the subject is stuck on. In here, Charlie, use the AI mask, but also use Magic Brush to get a better result around the edges of things. Don't just rely on, you know, rough drawing, because whatever you draw is what you're going to get. Georg, cities, you know, use the curves tool, use the HDR sliders, but sparingly, and give it a bit of a boost in the midtones. And Chris, going back to the beginning, this is one where, you know, the AI tool is fantastic. It saved me a lot of time in a lot of my edits recently. But sometimes it doesn't work, and it doesn't mean you have to go back to manual. There are other tools like the Magic Brush that are there. Right. Oh, Anthony, question. Is there a way, I guess you mean to get all the settings from a layer without the mask? Well, there kind of is, but in a weird way. So if I were to go on to Georg's shot here, and let's go on to our, in fact, those base edits. Well, I can right click here and say duplicate that layer, and then click on here and say clear mask. So I've now got all of the settings that were made to that base layer, but with no mask applied. So yes, you can get all the settings from a layer without the mask. You just duplicate the layer and then remove the mask. So cool. So hopefully that answers that one. I think we're kind of done with questions. So between now and next time, which will be next month, remember you can upload your raw files and we'll have a look at them. So paulreiferlive.wetransfer.com, you'll get there and there'll be a little button that you can upload. Send us the EIPs or the raw files with what you're having a problem with. Please include your name. If there's no name, we're not putting it on. Very simple. Remember, there's also all those masterclasses. There's quite a lot of them now. There will be more, but those masterclasses cover a load of different stuff around different genres of photography, mostly around city and landscape, but the tools are very, very similar. And between now and when we're next on, head there. Let's have lots of valuable arguments about what software's the right thing for the right job. But between now and next month, so next month's session, look after yourselves. Do upload images when you want to, if you want to have a look at them. And we'll see you then. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.